The emergency war room of the Valanthi High Council was located deep beneath the surface of the imperial capital world. A vast chamber that had not been used for genuine crisis management in over 3,000 years. Now every seat was filled with the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and every face showed expressions of confusion and fear that none of them would have admitted to feeling. Supreme Chancellor Velos sat at the head of the enormous table, his ancient body supported by a hovering throne that had been passed down through 200 generations of rulers. And his four eyes moved restlessly across the reports that floated in holographic displays around him. "This cannot be accurate," he declared, his voice carrying the rasp of extreme age. "Our scientists must have made errors in their calculations. The calculations have been verified 17 times. "Supreme Chancellor," replied the Chief Science Advisor, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke, "the human vessels are operating on principles we do not understand. Their weapons generate energy outputs that exceed our theoretical maximum by several orders of magnitude." Admiral Quan Jisu appeared on the main display screen, transmitted from her flagship at the edge of Imperial space, and her calm expression was somehow more frightening than any show of aggression would have been. "Distinguished members of the High Council," she said with a slight bow of her head, "the human sovereignty thanks you for agreeing to this communication. We understand that our appearance must be surprising." "Surprising," Chancellor Velos repeated, his voice rising with indignation. "You emerge from dead space with a fleet that defies everything we know about physics. And you call it surprising?" "We mean no disrespect," the Admiral replied, her tone remaining perfectly even. "We simply wish to discuss the terms of humanity's relationship with the Empire. The agreement that was made 30 years ago no longer reflects the reality of our situation." Councillor Thissa, the youngest member of the High Council and the only one who had argued against dismissing the initial reports, leaned forward in her seat with her hands pressed flat against the table. "You want to renegotiate?" she said, from a position of overwhelming military superiority. "And yet you come to us with words instead of weapons. Why?" Admiral Quan smiled slightly, and there was something in her expression that reminded Dayan of his grandmother, when she used to tell him stories about the old days before the Empire came, because destruction was never our goal, the Admiral answered. "We built these ships to ensure that we would never again be at the mercy of those who saw us as lesser beings. But we do not wish to become what we once feared." Chancellor Velos slammed his upper hands against his throne in frustration, the sound echoing through the war room. "You expect us to believe that you developed weapons capable of annihilating our civilization simply as a deterrent?" he demanded. "No species would invest such resources without intending to use them." "Then perhaps you do not understand humanity as well as you believed," Admiral Quan replied, and there was no mockery in her voice, only a kind of sad patience. "We have a saying among our people that the best weapon is one that never needs to be fired. We hope that showing you our capabilities would be enough to change your perspective." "Show us then," Councillor Thissa said suddenly, ignoring the shocked looks from her fellow council members. "If your weapons are truly as powerful as you claim, demonstrate them. Give us proof that we are not being deceived by some elaborate projection." The Admiral nodded as if she had expected this request. "Very well," she said. "We will provide a demonstration at the coordinates I am transmitting now. There is an uninhabited moon in that system that your Empire uses for weapons testing. We will show you what our smallest combat vessel can do." The war room fell silent as the council members exchanged glances of uncertainty and dread. An hour later, every sensor in the Empire was focused on a barren moon that had served as a target range for Imperial weapons development for the past 800 years. The human vessel that approached it was classified as a destroyer in sovereignty terminology, though it was still larger than most Imperial battleships. and it moved through space with an elegance that seemed almost organic. "They are in position," the sensor officer reported, a voice barely above a whisper on the display screens throughout the war room. The destroyer oriented itself toward the moon and went completely still. Nothing visible happened. There was no beam of light, no missile launch, no explosion of any kind. One moment the moon was there, a gray sphere of rock and dust that had existed for billions of years. The next moment, it simply ceased to exist. The sensors registered a massive spike of energy that lasted for less than a heartbeat. And then there was nothing but empty space where the moon had been. "What happened to it?" Chancellor Velos demanded, his voice cracking with something that sounded very much like terror. "Where did it go?" The chief science advisor stared at her instruments with an expression of complete incomprehension, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely operate her console. "It was converted," she finally managed to say. "The entire mass of the moon was transformed directly into energy and dispersed. There is nothing left to detect, no debris, no radiation signature. Nothing. That is impossible," another council member shouted, rising from his seat. "Matter cannot simply be converted to energy with perfect efficiency. The laws of physics do not allow it." Admiral Kwan's face reappeared on the main display, and her expression had not changed. "The laws of physics as you understand them," she said gently. "We had 30 years to explore possibilities that your empire never considered. 30 years of brilliant minds working without the constraints of your assumptions." She paused and let her words settle over the council like a shroud. "Our fleet contains over 3,000 vessels capable of performing that same demonstration," she continued. "We could sterilize every inhabited world in your empire before your ships could respond. And there is nothing you could do to stop us." The war room had become completely silent. Every council member frozen in their seats as they confronted the reality of their absolute vulnerability. "But we do not want to destroy you," Admiral Kwan said, and her voice carried a warmth that seemed impossible given what she had just revealed. "We want to live alongside you as equals. We want to share what we have learned and build something better together." Chancellor Velos looked like he had aged 1,000 years in the past few minutes, his hands gripping his throne as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. "What are your terms?" he asked, and his voice held none of its former arrogance. "Simple ones," the admiral replied. "Full sovereign status for humanity, the return of Earth to human governance, and a seat on the Galactic Council as your partners rather than your subjects." She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. "We gave you 30 years of peace. Supreme Chancellor, we used that time to ensure our survival. The question now is how you will use the future we are offering you." The imperial capital descended into chaos as news of the human fleet spread through official channels and unofficial whispers. And within days, the Volanthi High Council had fractured into 3 opposing factions that threatened to tear the empire apart from within. Chancellor Velos found himself struggling to maintain order as his own council members screamed accusations and demands at each other across the war room table. "We must strike immediately," bellowed Admiral Korath, the supreme commander of the imperial military, his massive frame trembling with rage. "Every moment we delay gives these humans time to position their forces. We still have numerical superiority in terms of total ships. Numerical superiority means nothing when they can destroy moons with a single shot," Councillor Thissa replied sharply. "Did you not witness the same demonstration that we all saw? Our entire fleet would be ash before we could fire a single weapon." "Then we surrender completely," suggested Councillor Venn, the eldest member besides the Chancellor himself. "We give them everything they want and hope they show us mercy." "Surrender to primitives," Admiral Korath roared. "The Volanthi Empire has stood for 12,000 years. We have never bent our knees to any species. And we will not start with these humans in the corner of the room. Standing quietly where he had been brought as an expert on human psychology, Yoon Dae-han watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of sadness and understanding. Commander Sefka had insisted on bringing him to the capital when she made her report, arguing that his knowledge of human culture might prove valuable to the council. He had not expected to find himself standing before the most powerful beings in the galaxy, but he had also not expected any of what had happened in the past few days. "You," Chancellor Vilo said suddenly, pointing one of his trembling fingers at Daehan. "You are human. You have lived among us for years. Tell us what your people truly want." Every eye in the room turned toward Daehan, and he felt the weight of their attention pressing down on him like a physical force. "They want what they said they want," he replied, keeping his voice calm even though his heart was racing. "Sovereignty, recognition, partnership. They are not lying about their intentions." "How can you know that?" Admiral Korath demanded. "You are one of the subjugated ones. You chose to remain under imperial rule. Why should we believe you understand those who rejected us?" "Because I know my people," Daehan said, and something in his tone made even the aggressive Admiral pause. "We are not like you. We do not think like you. When we build weapons, we hope never to use them. When we prepare for war, we pray for peace." He stepped forward, moving closer to the council table despite the guards, who shifted nervously at his approach. "The humans of the Sovereignty spent 30 years building that fleet," he continued. "Entire generations devoted their lives to constructing ships they would never see completed. Parents worked and died so that their children could continue the work, and their children did the same." Counselor Thiza leaned forward with genuine curiosity in her expression. "Why would anyone sacrifice so much for something they might never witness?" she asked. "Because they believed in something larger than themselves." Daehan answered, "They believed that their descendants deserved to live free, that humanity should never again be forced to bow before another species." He paused and looked around the room at all these powerful aliens who had ruled the galaxy for millennia without ever truly understanding the quiet determination of the species they had dismissed as unremarkable. They could have attacked at any time during those 30 years, he said. They could have emerged with vengeance in their hearts and destruction as their goal. But they waited until they were ready to offer you a choice instead of an ultimatum, before anyone could respond. Alarms began blaring throughout the war room as emergency displays flickered to life on every surface. "Admiral," a panicked voice reported over the communication system. "A faction of the Third Fleet has broken formation and is moving to engage the human vessels. They are not responding to our orders to stand down." Admiral Kareth's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like satisfaction. And Daehan realized with horror that this attack had been planned. "Sometimes," Korath said quietly, "warriors must act when their leaders cannot." The display showed a formation of Imperial warships streaking toward the Sovereignty fleet, their weapons charging as they approached. Daeun watched with his hands clenched into fists, knowing that what happened next would determine the fate of everyone in the galaxy. The Imperial ships opened fire with everything they had, beams of energy and volleys of missiles racing toward the human vessels in a storm of destructive power. The Sovereignty ships did not move. They did not return fire. They simply absorbed the attack. The displays showed the impossible sight of Imperial weapons splashing harmlessly against human shields, the most devastating arsenal the Empire could deploy, having no more effect than rain against mountains. The attack continued for several minutes as the Imperial ships exhausted their ammunition and drained their energy reserves. And through it all, the human fleet remained perfectly still. When the last weapon had been fired and the Imperial ships drifted helplessly with their systems depleted, Admiral Kwan's face appeared on the main display. Her expression was not angry or triumphant. She looked sad. "We hoped you would choose peace," she said quietly. "We prepared for you to choose otherwise." She turned her attention to someone off-screen and gave a brief command. And the display showed a single sovereignty destroyer moving forward instead of weapons. It deployed towing cables that attached to the disabled Imperial ships. "We will return your vessels and their crews to you unharmed," Admiral Kwan announced. "We will not punish soldiers for following the orders of those who would rather see us all destroyed than share power with beings they consider inferior." She looked directly into the camera, and it felt like she was staring into the soul of everyone who watched. "But understand this clearly," she said, her voice carrying an edge of steel beneath its gentle tone. "Our patience is not unlimited, and our offer will not remain open forever. The next attack will not end so mercifully." Chancellor Vilos turned to Admiral Korath with rage burning in all four of his eyes. "You have endangered everything," the Chancellor hissed. "Your pride has brought us to the edge of extinction." Korath said nothing, his earlier satisfaction crumbling into ash as he confronted the reality of what had just happened. His best ships had thrown everything they had against the humans, and they had not even bothered to fight back. Dae-Yun looked at the council members and saw the moment when understanding finally began to dawn on their faces. The sovereignty was not a threat to be eliminated. They were a force of nature to be accepted, and humanity was offering them a chance that they did not deserve. The treaty was signed on the anniversary of the day when the Volanthi Empire had first arrived in Earth's solar system 30 years before, and the ceremony took place aboard a human vessel that had been specifically designed for diplomatic functions. Chancellor Vilos moved slowly as he approached the signing platform, his ancient body seeming even more frail than it had weeks ago when this crisis began. Across from him stood Admiral Kwan Jisu, her dark uniform crisp and perfect, her expression warm but serious as she waited for the formal proceedings to conclude. Between them stood Yoon Dae-Yun, who had been chosen by both sides to serve as the official mediator and witness to this historic moment. He still could not quite believe how his life had changed in such a short time, from an ignored clerk on a survey vessel to someone whose words carried weight in the halls of galactic power. "The terms are agreed," Chancellor Vilos announced, his voice carrying through the chamber despite its weakness. "Earth shall be returned to human governance immediately. The human sovereignty shall be recognized as a full partner in galactic civilization, and a permanent seat on the council shall be established for human representation." He paused and looked at Admiral Kwan with eyes that had seen 12,000 years of imperial history. "The Volanthi Empire accepts these conditions," he continued, "and offers its hand in partnership rather than dominion." Admiral Kwan stepped forward and took his hand in a grip that was firm but gentle. "The human sovereignty accepts this partnership," she replied, "and pledges to work alongside the Empire as allies rather than conquerors. We build our future together or not at all." The assembled delegates from dozens of species watched in stunned silence as the two leaders pressed their marks onto the treaty documents, sealing an agreement that would reshape the galaxy. Dae-Yun felt tears forming in his eyes as the weight of the moment settled over him. His grandmother had dreamed of this day and whispered stories about it to him when he was just a child. And now he was standing here watching it become reality after the ceremony concluded and the delegates began dispersing to their various vessels. Councillor Thesa approached Dae-Yun with a curious expression on her face. "I do not understand something," she admitted, her voice quiet so that only he could hear. "Your people had the power to take everything they wanted. You could have destroyed us and built your own empire on our ashes. Why did you choose peace instead?" Dae-Yun considered her question carefully before answering. "Because we had seen what empires built on conquest become," he said. "We had watched your civilization for 30 years while we built our fleet, And we saw how hollow your power truly was. He gestured toward the view screen where sovereignty and imperial ships now hung peacefully in the same space. We did not want to become you, he continued. We wanted to become something better, a force that used strength to protect rather than dominate, to build rather than destroy. Thesa nodded slowly, and there was something in her expression that looked almost like hope. Perhaps we can learn from you, she said. Perhaps your arrival is exactly what our civilization needed to remember what we once aspired to be. 3 weeks later, Dayan stood on the surface of Earth for the first time since he was a young child. The sky was blue above him, bluer than he remembered, and the air carried sense of growing things that made him feel like he was dreaming. His parents stood beside him, both of them weeping openly as they looked at the world that had finally been returned to their people. Your grandmother would be so proud, his mother whispered, gripping his hand tightly. She always believed this day would come in the distance. He could see sovereignty vessels descending through the atmosphere, bringing home the descendants of those who had left 30 years ago. They were meeting their cousins who had stayed behind. Families reuniting across generations of separation. A world coming back together after being torn apart. Admiral Kwan found him later that evening, standing alone on a hillside overlooking the city where he had been born. You did well, she said, coming to stand beside him. Your testimony to the council helped them understand who we really are. I only told them the truth, Dayan replied. I told them what my grandmother taught me, what our people have always believed, even when we had to hide it. The admiral smiled and reached into her uniform pocket, withdrawing a small folded paper. I have something for you, she said, pressing it into his hands. This was found in our archives. It belonged to one of the original colonists who left Earth 30 years ago. Dayan unfolded the paper carefully and found himself looking at a set of blueprints, hand-drawn diagrams of starships that had not existed yet when they were created. His grandmother's handwriting filled the margins. Notes and calculations and hopes committed to paper by a woman who had chosen to stay behind so that her knowledge could travel with those who left. She was one of the designers, Admiral Kwan said quietly. She helped create the first generation of our ships before she decided that her place was here, keeping the secret safe until we were ready to return. Dayan pressed the paper against his chest and let the tears fall freely down his face. His grandmother had been part of this from the very beginning, had helped build the foundation of everything the sovereignty had become. She had raised him with stories and secrets, preparing him for a moment she might never see. She would have loved this, he managed to say through his tears. She would have loved knowing that it all worked out. Admiral Kwan put her hand on his shoulder. It worked out because of people like her, she said, and people like you. The ones who carried the dream through the darkness until the light finally came in the sky above Earth. Human and Volanthi ships patrolled together for the first time in history, flying in formations that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. The galaxy had changed forever, not because humanity had conquered it, but because they had offered something that 12,000 years of empire had never provided: a partnership of equals. A future worth believing in, as Dayan looked up at those ships moving together through the stars. He finally understood what his grandmother had been trying to tell him all those years ago. The dreams of ancestors become the reality of their children, and those children carry these dreams forward too. Generations yet unborn. The waiting was over, but the building had just begun. The bridge of the Imperial survey vessel hummed with the quiet rhythm of routine work, and Senior Surveyor Yoon Dae-yoon stared at his console with the same boredom he had felt for the past 7 years of his service to the Volanthi Empire. He was one of the few humans who worked directly under Imperial officers, a position that sounded impressive but meant nothing in practice, because the Volanthi viewed humans as useful but unremarkable creatures who had been absorbed into their civilization. 30 years ago, without much fanfare or resistance. Commander Sethka stood at the center of the bridge, her forearms folded behind her back as she watched the view screen with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered a genuine threat in her entire career. The Volanthi had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had never met a species they could not conquer, absorb, or simply ignore into irrelevance. Surveyor Yoon, Sethka said without looking at him. Confirm our position relative to the rim boundary. Yes, Commander, Daehyun replied, keeping his voice neutral and respectful as he had learned to do since childhood. We are currently 47 units from the edge of mapped space, approaching the dead zone at standard survey speed. The dead zone was what the Empire called the vast region of space beyond the rim, a place where no intelligent species had ever developed according to Imperial records, a cosmic wasteland that held nothing of value and therefore received nothing of the Empire's attention. Daehyun had always wondered about that designation, because the universe was vast and the Empire's certainty seemed almost arrogant. But he had learned long ago to keep such thoughts to himself. Sensor contact, announced the officer at the detection station, her voice carrying a hint of confusion that made everyone on the bridge turn toward her. Multiple signatures emerging from beyond the rim boundary. Sethka's upper eyes narrowed while her lower pair blinked in what Daehyun had learned to recognize as Volanthi surprise. Clarify, the commander ordered. Nothing exists beyond the rim. The sensors are detecting a fleet. Commander, the officer replied, her hands moving rapidly across her controls. But the readings do not match any known classification in our database. Daehyun felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched the data stream across his own console. Numbers and measurements that made no logical sense according to everything that Empire knew about starship construction. The power signatures alone were impossible, registering at levels that exceeded Imperial dreadnoughts by factors of hundreds. And the ships themselves appeared to be enormous beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. There must be a malfunction in the sensor array, Sethka declared with the absolute confidence of someone who could not accept evidence that contradicted her understanding of reality. Move us closer for visual confirmation, Commander, Daehyun said carefully, knowing that speaking out of turn could earn him punishment. Perhaps we should maintain distance until we understand what we are observing. Sethka finally looked at him, and her expression carried the dismissive contempt that most Volanthi showed toward humans when they dared to offer opinions. When I require the counsel of a clerk, Surveyor Yoon, I will request it, she said coldly. How? Take us to visual range. The ship moved forward through the darkness of space, and Daehyun watched his console with growing dread as the readings became clearer and more terrifying with every passing moment. The fleet that was emerging from the dead zone numbered in the thousands, and their smallest vessels were larger than anything the Volanthi Empire had ever constructed. Visual range achieved, the helm officer reported, and the main view screen flickered to life with an image that silenced every voice on the bridge. The ships were beautiful in a way that made them even more frightening, their hulls gleaming with a dark metallic sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their designs angular and aggressive in ways that spoke of war rather than exploration. They moved with a grace that should have been impossible for vessels of their size, formations shifting and adjusting with perfect coordination as if guided by a single mind. Daehyun stared at the view screen and felt his heart stop, because he recognized those ships not from any Imperial database or military briefing, but from memories he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten they existed. His grandmother had shown him the blueprints when he was just a child, old drawings that she kept hidden in a box that she made him promise never to speak of to anyone. These are the dreams of your ancestors, She had whispered to him in the darkness of their small apartment on Earth. And one day, those dreams will become real. He had thought she was simply an old woman lost in fantasy, clinging to stories that helped her cope with the reality of living under imperial rule. Now he understood that she had been telling him the truth. "What are those things?" Sethka whispered. And for the first time since Dayan had known her, he heard fear in her voice. The communication console suddenly activated with a burst of static, and then a voice filled the bridge, speaking in a language that the Imperial translation systems could not process. But Dayan understood every word, because the voice was speaking Old Korean, a language that his grandmother had taught him in secret, a language that no alien species would ever recognize children of Earth. The voice said, calm and steady and filled with quiet power, "Your waiting is over. Stand clear." Dayan felt tears forming in his eyes as the meaning of those words washed over him. As 30 years of hidden history suddenly made sense when the Volanthi had come to Earth 3 decades ago. Humanity had surrendered without a fight, accepting integration into the Empire with what everyone assumed was simple pragmatism. But that surrender had been a lie, a performance designed to buy time while the true plan unfolded in the darkness beyond the rim. The humans who remained on Earth became compliant subjects, useful workers who never caused trouble and never drew attention. The others, the scientists and engineers and dreamers who refused to accept subjugation, had scattered to the empty regions of space where no one would think to look for them. And for 30 years, they had built and prepared and waited for this moment. "Surveyor Yoon," Sethka said sharply, turning toward him with all 4 of her eyes fixed on his face. "You understand that transmission. I can see it in your expression. Tell me what they said." Dayan looked at his commander. This Volanthi officer who had treated him as barely more than furniture for 7 years, who had never once considered that the quiet human clerk at the sensor station might be anything more than he appeared. He thought about his grandmother and her hidden blueprints, about his parents who had chosen to stay on Earth and raise their children as imperial subjects while knowing the truth. He thought about all the humans across the galaxy who had lived quiet lives of apparent acceptance while carrying the same secret in their hearts. They said that everything is about to change, Dayan replied. And for the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to smile. Commander Sethka grabbed Dayan by the front of his uniform and lifted him from his chair with 2 of her 4 arms. Her face twisted into an expression of rage and confusion that he had never seen from her before. "You will explain what is happening," she hissed. "You will tell me everything you know about those ships and that transmission, or I will have you executed for treason against the Empire." Dayan did not struggle against her grip, because he understood that nothing she could do to him mattered anymore. Not with that fleet hanging in space like a promise finally kept. "I will tell you what I know," he said calmly. "But you will not believe me until you see the proof for yourself." She released him with a sound of disgust and stepped back. Her lower arms folded while her upper pair pointed at him in accusation. "Speak," she commanded. 30 years ago, when the Empire came to Earth, my people did not truly surrender," Dayan began, straightening his uniform with hands that trembled slightly. "We allowed you to believe that we had accepted our place in your civilization, but that was only what we wanted you to see." The bridge had gone completely silent as every officer turned to listen, their alien faces showing various expressions of disbelief and growing alarm. "Impossible," Sethka declared. "We monitored Earth constantly after integration. We knew everything that happened on that planet. You knew what we allowed you to know," Dayan replied. "My grandmother told me the truth when I was young, though I did not fully understand until this moment." He gestured toward the view screen where the massive fleet continued to hold position. Thousands of warships that dwarfed everything the Empire had ever constructed. When your ships first appeared in our solar system, our leaders understood that we could not win an immediate war, he explained. Our technology was primitive compared to yours. Our military was scattered across a single planet. We had no chance of resistance, so you surrendered like cowards, Sethka said with contempt. So we planned like survivors, Dahyun corrected her. And something in his voice made her take a step backward. In the months before your official arrival, while your diplomats were negotiating what you called integration, our greatest minds disappeared. He remembered his grandmother's stories now with perfect clarity. Tales she had whispered to him in the darkness, while his parents pretended not to hear. Scientists, engineers, military strategists, they all vanished into regions of space that your empire had labeled worthless, he continued. They took everything they needed to start over. Hidden colonies in the dead zone where no one would think to look for them. That is not possible, the censor officer interrupted, her voice shaking. We would have detected their ships, their communications, their energy signatures. Would you? Dahyun asked. When you had already decided that the dead zone contained nothing of value. When your patrols never bothered to conduct thorough scans of a region you considered empty. The truth of his words hung in the air like poison, and he watched as the implications spread across the faces of everyone on the bridge. The Empire had been so certain of its own superiority that it had never questioned its assumptions about the universe for 30 years. Those humans built in secret, Dayan said, pointing at the view screen. Entire generations lived and died in hidden colonies, working toward a goal they might never see achieved, constructing ships that they might never fly, all so that one day their descendants could do what we are witnessing right now. The communication console activated again, and this time a different voice emerged. Speaking in the common imperial language that everyone could understand, this is Admiral Kwon Jisoo of the Human Sovereignty Fleet, the voice announced, firm and controlled and carrying an authority that made Sethka visibly flinch. We request a diplomatic channel with the Volanthi High Council to discuss the renegotiation of humanity's status within galactic civilization. Sethka stared at the console as if it had transformed into a venomous creature, her forearms hanging limply at her sides as the magnitude of the situation overwhelmed her. They want to negotiate, she whispered. After revealing a fleet that could destroy us all, they want to talk. Dahyun understood what she could not, because he knew his people in ways that the Volanthi had never bothered to learn. That is who we are, he said quietly. We built weapons that could end your civilization, but we would rather use words. We prepared for war so that we could choose peace. The view screen flickered as a direct visual feed was established, and Admiral Kwon Jisoo appeared before them. A human woman with gray streaking her dark hair and eyes that held the weight of decades spent carrying an impossible burden. She wore a uniform that Dahyun had never seen before, black with silver trim and a symbol on her chest that showed Earth encircled by stars. Commander of the Imperial vessel, the Admiral said, her gaze steady and unafraid. I suggest you contact your superiors and inform them that humanity wishes to speak with them. We have waited 30 years for this conversation, and we would prefer not to wait any longer. Sethka turned to Dahyun with something in her expression that he had never seen directed at him before. It took him a moment to recognize it as respect. What do I tell them? She asked, and her voice was almost pleading. What do I say to the High Council about what is happening here? Dahyun looked at the Admiral on the view screen, at the fleet of impossible warships that represented the dreams and sacrifices of 3 generations of his people. Tell them the truth, he said. Tell them that the species they dismissed as primitive and unremarkable has returned, and that nothing will ever be the same again. He paused and met Admiral Kwon's eyes through the screen, and he could have sworn that she smiled slightly at him. And tell them that despite everything, We are still willing to be their partners," he added, "if they are wise enough to accept what we offer." The Admiral nodded once in acknowledgement, and Dayan felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he had carried since childhood without even realizing it was there. He had spent his whole life pretending to be less than he was, hiding his heritage and his knowledge to survive in a galaxy that saw his people as nothing special. That time was over now. The waiting was finally done.